Thank you for that wonderful introduction. It is really both a pleasure and an honor to be here. I think the project that you're engaged in is incredibly spectacular, and I'm hoping to learn a whole lot this weekend about Canadian art and Canadian women artists. One of the peculiarities of art history in the United States is that while many art historians look south to Latin America, very few of us look north. And I'm hoping that one of the things I can do when I go back is to tell them how foolish they've been for not looking north a lot more. Okay, so let me get started. The decades around 1900 saw a wave of interest in writing the history of women artists. That wave, however, broke rather quickly, leaving no more than a few ripples on the surface of the discipline. Not only did the history of women artists not materialize as a continuous swell in the history of art, but women's art as a historical phenomenon largely dropped out of public view. At best, women's works were submerged in the bowels of museums. At worst, they were missing, with no last known address. As a group, women artists lost a history of their own, and many individuals were swept away from our national and general histories of art. They had to wait for nearly half a century until interest in their lives and works surged again. Thinking about this particular history leads me to reformulate Edmund Burke's warning. Those who do not continuously represent their histories are destined to forget them, at least for a time. Rather than developing through addition, refinement, contestation, and revision, the history of women artists began again around 1970 in a process of recovery, that is to say, a process of repetition. So this afternoon, I'd like to begin by reminding us of the long history of writing the history of women artists, because in thinking through that history, we might better understand not only from where we've come, but also to where we might want to go, and why. As in the past, we are getting there to wherever we're going, alongside those engaged in writing the history of women into history itself. Like those categories that define national and sexual identities, that of history has its exclusions. Our current disciplinary perspectives tend to distinguish between history and biography. Yet for centuries, the biography of an exemplary life was an essential form of history writing, and one no less significant than narratives of specific events. Collective biography was the first form of women's history, a history far from the so-called scientific objective history that would become the norm in the 19th century following the works of Leopold von Ranke. Among the ancients, Plutarch composed biographies of virtuous women to show that the female sex could and should profit from education, and other writers follow suit, including Christine de Pizan and Madeleine de Scudéry. Artists were not typically included in these first collections, although they would appear later in dictionaries and galleries of celebrated women. That is, women distinguished not only because they played some role in history, but also for their achievements in arts and letters. These general collections of notable women continued to appear throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, authored by men and women, published in France, England, Canada, the United States, and elsewhere. This genre continues today in both textual and online versions, often focused on a particular era or national tradition. One excellent example to which many art historians have contributed is the Dictionnaire des femmes de l'Ancienne France. Although women artists appeared in collections focused on celebrated women, these were not their first entry into art history. As we know, women were included in that biographical subgenre, Lives of the Artists, which were in fact the first histories of art. Pliny the Elder, Giorgio Vasari, and Carl van Mander all sprinkled a few famous women into their artist lives. And in the 18th century, Michel d'André Bardon included Sophie Charon in his 1756 Catalogue des plus fameux peintres, sculptures et gravures de l'école française. In the next century, William Dunlop mentioned women, mostly in passing, in his two-volume History of the Rise and Development of the Arts and Design in the United States of 1834, and Charles Blanc included some women in his Histoire des peintres de toutes les écoles, published between 1865 and 77. But in these key texts, women form only a very small percentage of those artists written into art history. The first consideration of women painters as a group apart, at least the first that I know of, came in 18th century France in 1783 in the Nouvelle de la République des Arts et des Lettres, which was the journal of Pahin de la Blanchery's Salon de la Correspondance, which also provided a venue for women artists to exhibit their work outside the Academy's salon. The account, titled Femme Peintre, appeared as a letter from a correspondent identified only as Bartoli. Although the success of Elisabeth Vigée-Lebrun may have motivated Bartoli, the letter names women of distinction who flourished as painters in 17th century Italy, as well as those recently received into Italian academies. He goes on to mention ancient Roman women who were known to paint, as well as an international group of 18th century women, including Rosalba Carriera, Anne Terbuche, Angelica Kaufmann, Marie-Thérèse Raboul, Anne Vallier-Costet, Adelaide Le Biguillard, and Rosalie Filloul. Of course, mentioning their names hardly constitutes a history in this two-page letter. I doubt, however, that women in 1783 were satisfied to be classed as femmes peintres. Just as many women artists today resist such characterization. For the 18th century, the term separated women painters from the male colleagues with whom they were in collaboration and competition. The terms femme peintre or peintresse, moreover, could indicate mere craftsmanship, while the term artiste suggested greater imaginative achievement. Indeed, those who wanted to praise women painters called them a bel homme in the case of Vallier-Costet, a grand homme in the case of Vigée-Lebrun. Vigée-Lebrun, moreover, painted herself not into a history of women artists, but into a history of great artists, undertaking at her own initiative a self-portrait that she presented to the Duke of Tuscany in 1790 to hang in his gallery of celebrated artists, a gallery that I consider the visual equivalent to the collections of artists' lives. Nearly all of the other works that hung in the Duke's collection were either commissioned or purchased. Vigée-Lebrun's offer of her own self-portrait was a strategic act and a bold one, risking, of course, that it would not be accepted as worthy of inclusion. Amassed by the Dukes of Tuscany and now housed in the Vasari corridor of the Uffizi, this collection of self-portraits was as famous in the 18th century as it is today. Travelers on the Grand Tour and other well-to-do visitors constituted its primary audience for this collection, whose history suggests that it was also maintained to preserve these images for posterity. We know from records of other artists that inclusion in this collection carried prestige because it was known that only the, quote, justly celebrated were allowed into that company. With her self-portrait hanging in this prestigious collection, Vigée-Lebrun would rub shoulders with Raphael and Rubens, as well as with Lavinia Fontana and Rosalba Carriera. Now, Vigée-Lebrun was not the first woman painter to paint herself into the history of art. The great Sophie Charon had earlier accomplished this feat by offering to the academicians the very first reception piece that was a self-portrayal. Because women artists were always elected to the Academy as exceptions, they were asked to choose among their works one or two to stand as reception pieces. Male artists were usually assigned a subject, and male portrait painters were regularly assigned to make portraits of another academician, thereby forming for the Academy a visual history of its members. That history was displayed in the Academy's quarters, and from time to time the works were shown in public exhibits. No male artist, of course, was ever asked to paint the portrait of an academicien as his reception piece, and so Sophie Charon's strategic choice was a way to do for herself what no one else would do for her. These practices suggest the desire of women artists to find a place in history through their presence in galleries of celebrated artists, whether textual or visual. I also bring Vigée-Lebrun and Charon into contact to make another point about how women artists enter or do not enter history. Sophie Charon's self-portrait is one of the very few, perhaps the only, extant work that is securely from her hand. Renowned in her own day not only as a painter, but also as a poet and writer on art, Sophie Charon dropped out of art history long ago. But Vigée Lebrun has been one of the few women continually remembered, and she ensured this resemblance less by appearing in the Duke's gallery and more in publishing her Souvenir, an autobiography and a memoir that has, in one form or another, been continually republished since its first appearance in 1838. The importance of the Souvenir as the basis for writing the artist into the history of art can hardly be overstated. When interest in women artists surged around 1900, Vigée Lebrun became the subject of numerous studies in French and English. Volumes appeared in 1892, 1901, 1908, 1912, 1914, 1916, and two in 1919. And it is from this observation that I want to consider the writing of women into history in general and into art history in particular. The textual self-portrayals of women artists might be thought in relation to another form of history associated with women's writing. Historian Philippe Nora has suggested that in the first half of the 19th century, memoirs were understood as history. The Souvenir, in fact, fit into what Nora has termed history's romantic period, the time between 1820 and 1840 when memoirs were passionately collected, readily published, and voraciously read. Memoirs, he suggests, were history's privileged form, seen as the only direct way to bring back the past by plunging into its reality and truth. Although Nora focuses attention on memoirs of statesmen, literary historian Faith Beasley showed how women in 17th century France created their own representations of the past and negotiated their relation to history through memoir writing. She argues that these women were engaged in writing a form of history that was well recognized at the time and characterized as particulière. Such histories told of motivations, secrets, and intentions, and differed from histoire générale or histoire publique, which recorded only those public events worthy of being remembered. Although women rarely figured prominently in general histories, particular histories included them as motivating forces. Because of their involvement in court life, women became important as agents, and often as agents working behind the scenes. If women were both writers of particular histories and agents within those histories, when did women disappear from history books? Historians have marked this vanishing as coincident with the advent of scientific history in the second half of the 19th century, when women became local color for historical novels, but not subjects of serious historiography. At this point, biography was separated from history and lost its respectability. Thus, the professionalization of history and transformation of it from a literary genre into a scientific discipline had consequences for women as historical objects and also as historians. When objective scientific history was born in the mid-19th century, scientific art history was at best a gleam in its father's eye. The history of art as a history of celebrated artists' lives continued in works like that of Charles Blanc. And it is within this genre, allied with particular history, that the first extended histories of women artists appeared. In 1858, Ernst Guhl published Die Frauen in der Kunstgeschichte, a collection of artists' biographies that stopped at the end of the 18th century and include poets as well as visual artists. Guhl's work was followed closely by Elizabeth Ellet's Women Artists of All Ages and All Countries, published in London in 1859, a work whose title is deceptive, as many areas of the world and many different groups of women are excluded from the notion of all. It was likely, moreover, that only Ellet's nationalistic sentiments led her to include women artists of the United States in her volume. Probably few of us have read Elizabeth F. Ellet, the first woman to write a history of women artists. Her invisibility within the history of art history is unsurprising, and not only because the genre of artist biographies fell from favor. The omission of the many women across Europe and the Americas who did write about art responds to the habits of the discipline that for many centuries reduced the presence of women in the art world, taken as the milieu in which artists, critics, curators, restorers, dealers, patrons, and historians together did their work. So who was Elizabeth Ellet, and what can we learn from an analysis of her work? Ellet had a typical woman's education, and she attended girls' school in her hometown of Aurora, New York. She studied French, German, and Italian. For centuries, language training, unlike science, had been considered as an appropriate subject of learning for young ladies. Ellet began publishing translations of European literature as well as her own poetry in her early teens and continued to be a prolific writer. In general, she was interested in the roles and accomplishments of women in the United States, authoring one book on women's roles in the American Revolution and the founding of the Republic, and another on their participation in settling the Western frontier. Today, her works are labeled as, quote, popular historical accounts. Yet perhaps particular histories might better describe these works. For she comments in the preface about the difficulty of obtaining reliable sources on women's lives, and notes that political history says little and vaguely about women who bore their part in the revolution. And she continues, quote, the materials for a work treating of them and their actions and sufferings must be derived in great part from private sources. These include letters, memoirs, and the testimonies of surviving relatives. These private sources, incidentally, were those that scientific history eschewed in favor of documents such as wills, police records, or edicts. In her work on women artists, Ellet acknowledges her debt to Gould and other biographical collections. She adds many women not working in the so-called high arts, and women working in many different genres, including botanical illustrations, silk painting, paper cutting, gem engraving, wax modeling, miniature painting, engraving, and porcelain painting. And in adding women artists working in the United States, she draws again on private sources, noting that she prepared her sketches of living American women from material furnished by their friends. Although Ellet's work is obviously tied to earlier traditions, it might be thought also like the nascent cultural histories indebted to Hippolyte Taine, propagator of a sociological positivism in which nation, environment, and time are the causes of social products. Ellet's introduction on the different eras in which women worked takes up the broader social issues and conditions that formed the art of the period overall and women's art in specific. Her stated goal, moreover, combined the protocols of Taine's cultural analysis with those of particular history. On the one hand, her aim was, quote, to show what woman has done with the general conditions favorable or unfavorable to her efforts. And on the other, quote, to give such impressions of the character of each distinguished artist as may be derived from a faithful record of her experience. She also recognizes a larger purpose, quote, should the perusal of my book inspire with courage and resolution any woman who aspires to overcome difficulties in the achievement of honorable independence, or should it lead to a higher respect for the powers of women and their destined position in the realm of art, my object will be accomplished. In the latter regard, we can reconsider a final aspect of her work. Ellet speculates on the production of women who might have worked well before recorded history. Women who might have performed as artists in ancient Egypt and the Near East, in cultures that were long considered the cradles of art. It is in the work of these women that she sees the undying germs of art hidden in their spinning and weaving. In line with her argument about the relation of art making to social conditions, Ellis hypothesizes that women in the East made art by overcoming their debased state and capitalizing on their love of dress and ornamentation, which she sees as developed from their subservience and cloistered way of life. Despite its obvious stereotype of the East, I find Ellis's discussion of particular note, Not only does it locate the origin or germ of art in women's work and the prevailing social conditions, as imagined, but it also assumes women capable of such a cultural advance and imagines a development that proceeds from it. Contrast her assessment of weaving to the hypothesizing of Sigmund Freud, whose essay on femininity of 1933 posits weaving not as the germ of art, but as the single contribution of women to cultural achievement. It gets better. In the Freudian analysis, weaving is a dead end for women, whose lack of cultural achievement he locates in their physical lack and psychological wound that lack delivers. For Freud, weaving is a mimetic art invented by women in copying the natural design of their pubic hair. Yeah, he really says this. Itself nature's plan, at least in Freud's way of thinking, of covering over the lack that woman must hide to make herself attractive to men. Yeah, thus, I just love Freud. Just the contrast between Ellis's and Freud's account of weaving speaks to a division in the way woman, and hence women's relation to the art, has been conceived. Ellis represents the societal view, which sees women as the sex that occupies a particular place in a specific social order, whereas Freud represents the essential view, which sees woman as different from man because dominated by her physical and psychological difference, and those differences he imagines as coming entirely from her sex organ, or in Freud's terms, her lack thereof. While Ellis's imaginary origin of art is located in an analysis of social conditions, at least to some extent, Freud gave women's contribution to culture a new scientific base, but his theorizing was driven by long-standing assumptions about the essential nature of woman. Anatomy had been destiny for women artists well before Freud. Consider, for example, Léon Lagrange's essay, Du rang des femmes dans les arts, published in the Gazette des Beaux-Arts in 1860, just 1 year after the appearance of Ellet's book. Lagrange's analysis restates long-standing assumptions about women's bodies and minds. Yet his essentializing is surprising because Lagrange was a classmate of Hippolyte Taine, and as an art historian has been credited with early on exploring the role of society in art production. Yet in the case of women, that exploration is undercut by his insistence on locating women's art in her physical body and psychological inclinations. This aspect of his essay is particularly surprising since it follows his enumeration of women who, like Vigée Lebrun and Artemisia Gentileschi, were justly celebrated. Yet Lagrange is arguing for women's training in arts at a very different level, hardly expecting they can perform as did those exceptional women. Women, he claims, will not choose art where men have genius. They will eschew great architectural conceptions, elevated painting, and the work of the ideal. They will avoid le grand art, but rather their choices will be in those genres that women have always preferred: portrait, pastel, miniature, flower painting. Women, he contends, are content to be in the second rank as long as they can please. And pleasing, of course, had long been conceived as both the destiny and desire of women. But more to my point is that he locates women's art in their physical and mental attributes. Women's delicate hands are made to paint fragile porcelain, and who, besides a woman, he asks, has the patience for hand-coloring thousands of illustrations? Who but a woman could represent on an ivory miniature the most exquisite sentiment of maternal tenderness? Finally, women's education in the arts is not threatening to her modesty. He claims that unlike the dancer or musician, the artist does not sell her person to the public, but hides it in her works. Shades of Rousseau. Thus, Lagrange presses his case for women's utility to the fine arts by relying on pre-Freudian stereotypes about the female body and mind, from their delicate hands to their minds that can sustain the boredom of repetitive work, to their maternal sentiment and their need to preserve modesty, a need that since Rousseau had been located in nature rather than culture. The initial mid-19th century interest in writing the history of women artists was not immediately followed by other general histories of women artists. But in the late 1870s, works began to appear in increasing numbers, all continuing the tradition of artist biographies. There were also at that time 8 monographs on Vigée Lebrun, 1 on La Biguillard, 2 on Angelica Kaufman. So what accounts for this wave of interest in women artists? Following those theorists who posited a relation between social conditions and cultural production, I suggest the totally obvious point that the women's movement of the late 19th and early 20th centuries accounts for this blossoming. And certainly those who wrote about women artists saw things in precisely this way. Consider, for example, one of the essays published in the first illustrated history of women painters, edited by Walter Sparrow. This one. The essay on French women was penned by historian and curator Léonie Benedict, who was the first director of the Musée du Luxembourg and then the first curator of the Rodin Museum. His essay was published only in an English translation, which I must assume was reasonably faithful to the French original. Benedict's discussion is quite clear on why there is such an interest in writing the history of women artists around 1900. Woman in art, he writes, quote, has a special, up-to-date character by virtue of the grave question arising from the position of woman in our social system of today. It is indeed the position of woman which has for so long a period set limits on her production of creations of the mind, and her position has had a distinct bearing on her inspiration. Thus it will be grasped in these times of ours when the movement for the total emancipation of woman has already commenced, and when the first franchises given to her have already borne conclusive results, how it is that our honored colleague, the editor of this book, has been led, both as an artist and writer on art, to conduct a historical examination, enabling one to understand the position woman has won in the realms of art in the past and permitting one to foresee the place that she is called on to occupy in the future. Not only does Benedict consider woman's position in society as a determining factor, but he makes what for me is the significant, if obvious, claim. Interest in women coincided with the women's movement. This movement was visible throughout Europe and North America and would have been visible in Paris, where between 1900 and 1905, Madame Marguerite Sully-Darac taught feminology at the Collège Libre des Sciences Sociales, a forum for innovative studies offering courses such as the feminist movement, feminism in the reign of Louis XIV. In regard to France, Tamar Garb's book, Sisters of the Brush, articulates the relation between feminist movements and the Union of Women Painters and Sculptors, founded in 1881 to represent the interests of women artists and facilitate the exhibition of their work. Other women artist societies developed around that same time. In Montreal, for example, the Association Culturelle des Femmes, or the Women's Art Society. And in the United States, the National Association of Women Artists. Although Benedict is generous in attributing a certain open-mindedness to the editor of the volume, Sparrow himself relies on those long-standing stereotypes. So in this book, we have both considerations together. In introducing the volume, and makes no mention of the women's movement in the United States. The introduction begins by separating genius into masculine and feminine forms, and then comments on the results when masculine or feminine genius does not match the sexed body. In one sense, Sparrow's writing might be seen to make an early distinction between sex and gender, recognizing that there are specific traits designated as masculine or feminine because imagined as naturally belonging to male or female bodies, yet that these traits are nevertheless separable from those sexed bodies. It must be admitted, however, that the idea that some men took on the qualities natural to women and some women those natural to men was an old one and common to the medical and moral discourses since the 18th century. And such gender bending was usually seen as violating the laws of nature. What was, of course, absent from Sparrow's consideration was the more recent notion that gender is culturally constructed. In his attitude toward the mismatch between sex and gender, Sparrow reveals a fundamentally essentialist position. What is genius, he asks, quote, is it not both masculine and feminine? Are not some of its qualities instinct with manhood, while others delight us with the most winning graces of a perfect womanhood? Does not genius make its appeal as a single creative agent with a twofold sex? But if genius has its Mirandas and its Regans, and no less than its infinite types of men, its union of the sexes does not remain always at peace within the sphere of art. Sometimes in the genius of men, the female characteristics gain mastery over the male qualities. At other times, the male attributes of women's genius win empire and precedence over the female. And whenever these things happen, the works produced in art recede from the world's sympathies, losing all their freshness. Thus, we find in 1900 already a split within the same history of women artists between one author upholding an essentialist notion of difference and another positing, if only implicitly, that difference is related to position in the social order. The tension between these positions would emerge quite differently in an updated version in the debates between forms of feminist theory in the 1980s, when another women's movement was well underway. How and why the interest in writing the history of women artists ignited around 1900 sputtered and died, I cannot say. What becomes clear, however, is that it took another women's movement to awaken that interest in women artists, and rather than building on a continuous tradition, those interested in writing the history more or less started from scratch all over again. In examining this new wave of interest in writing the history of women artists, I wish to consider now the following questions. Why did the initial enthusiasm for recovering women artists in the 1970s give way to other questions about women and the visual arts? Is this a propitious time to take up the recovery effort? What sorts of histories of women artists might we wish to write in the 21st century? And fundamentally, how can older versions of history writing inform our new histories? I begin by noting that although the feminist movement may have sparked the more recent interest in women's art, since the 1970s, that interest has been kept alive by historians of both sexes and of all stripes, by those who align themselves with feminism and those who do not. Yet many art historians, as we know, got fired up only in 1791 when Linda Nochlin posed the impertinent question, why have there been no great women artists? In an essay indebted to the work of Simone de Beauvoir and published first in Art News. That essay, as you probably know, followed the first feminist studio art class started in Fresno State University in fall of 1970, led by Judy Chicago, and that course eventually developed an entire program. The combined action of artists, art historians, and art critics was essential in developing this wave of interest in women's work, and curators joined the effort in two path-breaking exhibits. The first was the National Gallery of Canada's 1975 Some Canadian Women Artists, and the next, Women Artists 1550 to 1950, held at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. As suggested by these exhibitions, this new wave of interest in women's art operated on two fronts, recovering women of the past and supporting the work of women in the present. At the same time, another front was operated in reevaluating traditional women's work, quilts and needlework in particular, that art history had cast outside the category of the fine arts. In those first heady years of interest in women's art, mainstream art publications also joined in making visible the absence of women in the history of art and in contemporary art exhibitions. In 1974, the Art Journal, of the College Art Association published an essay on the state of women's studies in art history. Its findings were not surprising. In the basic art history survey books then available, not one woman artist was mentioned. There were very few works by women held in museum collections. In the National Gallery of Art in Washington, for example, there were no women sculptors. Women counted for 1.2% of the collection, and in the graphic arts, a whopping 1.3%. MoMA had an even worse record, if you can imagine. Only 0.5% of one-person shows mounted before 1972 featured women artists. With these sorts of statistics, the situation seemed dire indeed. and the direness of this situation called for drastic action, which began to shift the focus of the feminist movement in art history, moving it from the effort to recover the works of women artists to the project of changing the system, of revolutionizing the way art history was done. As Linda Nochlin observed retrospectively in Women, Art, and Power and other essays, critique has always been at the heart of my project and remains there today. I do not conceive of a feminist art history as a positive approach to the field, a way of simply adding a token list of women painters and sculptors to the canon. The comments that follow clarify her meaning. When Nochlin says that feminist art history is not a positive approach to the field, she means that the practice seeks not to add a few women to the canon, but to challenge and change the very premises of the discipline. Yet, despite what may have been her intention, Nochlin's comments work in some way to devalue the recuperation effort, for her statement implies that such an effort would not, in and of itself, bring the needed change to the discipline. Taking her comments to heart, one might well ask, what's the use of recuperating the work of women artists if the premises that have traditionally excluded them still reign in the discipline of art history? If incorporating women artists into the history of art was seen as an ineffective strategy for revolutionizing the discipline, gender analysis came to be touted as game-changing. The concept of gender as a culturally constructed counterpart to the assumed division between the sexes was widely adopted as a revolutionary strategy for interpretation. Gender had advantages over the recuperation of women artists, especially since it could be used as a tool to probe the art of both men and women, and as such, it could potentially disrupt the narratives of great masters and redirect them to different conclusions. In 1988, two highly influential accounts of gender as a useful, if not revolutionary, category of analysis appeared, which consolidated and exemplified trends that art history had been taking root. Joan Wallach Scott, of course, Gender, a Useful Category of Historical Interpretation, published in Gender and the Politics of History, and Griselda Pollock's Vision and Difference. Pollock argued for a, quote, rewriting of the history of art in terms which firmly locate gender relations as a determining factor in cultural production and in signification. Her aim was to show, quote, how a feminist intervention exceeds a local concern with, quote, the woman question, and makes gender central to our terms of historical analysis, adding parenthetically, always in conjunction with other structurations such as class and race, which are mutually inflecting. In the 1990s, nearly every session at the College Art Association conference included at least one paper that wrestled with issues of gender. But while many art historians took up gender analysis, significantly fewer combined that analysis with either writing about a specific woman artist or writing the history of women artists. Some did, but there were many fewer. The emphasis on gender analysis reinforced one aspect of business as usual in the history of art. Women remain more visible as objects of art making than as the makers of art. And there was perhaps a good reason for this unintentional support of the status quo. Without the recuperation of women artists in history, there are relatively few women artists available for gender studies. While gender studies offered the promise of revolutionizing the traditional practices of the discipline, other developments problematized the study of women artists. The most significant critiques came not from any backlash of traditional art history, although these were predictably present, but from two other directions. First, from those engaged with other forms of difference, and second, from those who embrace high French theory that had gradually infiltrated the discipline in the 70s and 80s, by which I mean the structuralism and post-structuralism of Barthes, Foucault, Derrida, and Lacan. In the beginning, the historical recuperation of women artists was initially directed toward white women hailing from Europe, or rather a few selected areas of Europe, and North America. Feminism at the same time was critiqued as primarily white bourgeois phenomenon. Under pressure from scholars concerned with other forms of difference, the focus on women artists did in fact expand to include women of color, women of First Nations, women in Africa, women in Asia, and lesbian artists, and so forth. But this was a relatively slow process. The larger point that eventually became evident was that women, like all living beings, had many cross-cutting identities, and characterizing them simply as women, or for that matter as lesbians or Mohawk or working class, could work to devalue other identities. Thus, to write the history of women artists, even a history restricted to the same time and place, became not only highly problematic, but also highly complicated. How could all these cross-cutting identities be contained in a single frame? What was left as a common denominator of the category was what they shared, the same physical sex. And this idea was exceptionally problematic. Debates in feminism itself in the 1980s circulated around that old problem of essentialism and posed this question: is there any such thing as a woman? Or as Denise Riley asked in the title of her well-known book, also published in 1988, am I that name? And in that same year, Diana Foose published Essentially Speaking. Foose's purpose was not to argue for or against essentialism, but to break the hold that the essentialist constructionist binarism had on feminist theory. And that, of course, is that old construction that goes all the way back to the 19th century. Her work partook of the impulse to deconstruct all binary oppositions, an impulse largely indebted to the work of Jacques Derrida. Her argument was that feminism had itself reached an impasse, quote, predicated on the difficulty of theorizing the social in relation to the natural, unquote. Or otherwise said, the socially constructed versus the naturally given. In Foose's view, essentialism in feminism was not only related to the claim that there was some female essence outside the social, but also that there was not a totalizing symbolic system that subjugated all women. That would be, in her terms, a claim rooted in some social essentialism. Essentialism, she claimed, emerged when discourses, quote, presumed the unity of its object of inquiry, even when it points or pains to demonstrate the differences within this admittedly generalizing and imprecise category. Thus, to write any history of women artists from any single point of view might be said to be an essentializing project. Yet many scholars were willing to take what Foose called the risk of essentialism, and to keep writing about women as a group. Some historians and literary critics, for example, argued that the category of woman was necessary because one needed a subject in whose name rights could be claimed. Others, like Elaine Showalter, argued for maintaining the category of women's writing because she believed that there were writing traditions passed down from woman to woman. The question was never settled, but eventually scholars lost interest, feminism became less fashionable, and it was replaced by other academic passions. Although today we should be aware of this debate, as well as the pitfalls of essentialism, continuing the debate seems unproductive if it prevents us from noting, analyzing, critiquing, celebrating, interpreting, and writing the histories of women artists who remain in the shadows and margins. Moreover, not attending to women's participation in the art world leaves us with a very, very partial view of art's history. At the same time that the essentialist constructionist arguments were underway, master narratives of national traditions, whether historical or art historical, were also viewed with a critical eye. Histories, as we well know, are written by the winners and often exclude all sorts of peoples and events. Early writers such as Ellet noted the exclusion of women from general histories, and women often compensated for this exclusion by writing particular histories, or as Ellet did, by writing women's history. United States history as a discipline has developed its own brand of subfields to fill the lacunae that still punctuate our master narratives of our national history. These include US women's history, African American history, Native American history, and so forth. But historians question the status of these subfields in relation to general history, and if creating subfields is enough to counterbalance the hold of master narratives. Although I do not believe it's enough, Without specialized, developed studies in subfields, new knowledge and different points of view cannot successfully be incorporated into larger historical narratives. While many contentious issues cross the discipline of history, art history, and literary history, one was more keenly felt by those who studied art and literature: the call for the death of the author, proposed in the writings of Roland Barthes and Michel Foucault. In the face of the author's possible demise, literary critics concerned with women writers, such as Nancy Miller and Jane Burns, asked what the death of the author might mean for a class of individuals, women, who by and large never had the opportunity to be called authors. While the death of the author might have given birth to the reader as the site where all the elements of a work were directed, it worked to demystify the categories of author or artist as the source that generated and controlled meaning. Gender analysis that focused on the representation of men and women in art and literature could accommodate this new turn. And so, in a sense, could feminism, by positing the agency of the woman reader or viewer. But needless to say, if historians and critics abandoned the author or artist, it would be rather more difficult to write a history of women as authors or artists who created meaning from a different position in the social order. Yet, of course, there were many historians and critics who did not want to see the artist or the author done in. Moreover, if the most traditionally minded scholars were keeping the great artist alive, that posed another dilemma for those scholars generally attracted to the work of Barthes and Foucault and also committed to feminist analysis. At this point, we should be asking if there is a way to abandon the artist as the one who controls the meaning of the work and still write a history of women artists. I, for one, believe there is. A history of women artists focused on a specific time and place can be generated from methods that are both sociological and particular, combining an analysis of social structures, artistic institutions, and women's place within them with an account of individual experiences and biographies. Such a history might take up the question of what it means to make art from a particular place in the social order. In contrast, an interpretation of specific works of art made by women can be developed along different lines that do not necessarily privilege intentionality or biographical interpretation. I see these as different but not mutually exclusive initiatives. At about the same time that the author died, the Catalogue raisonné, the traditional artist's monograph, and the artist's biography were also suffering, diagnosed in some quarters as retardataire genres of art history. This doesn't mean that art historians stopped producing these works, just that the new art history, as the social history of art came to be called in the United States, along with the even newer theoretically informed art history, diagnosed those earlier forms of art historical writing as terminally naive. Although many art historians began fleeing from those traditional forms, it was precisely those forms that produced the fundamental research from which more sophisticated histories and analyses grew. And perhaps the greatest irony was that many scholars who were casting aspersions on these more traditional forms totally relied on them to provide the informational base on which their own work depended. What might have happened instead of abandoning these genres was a calculated updating of them. Now, some 30 or more years later, that process is underway and has been. Let me give one example I recently know about. I served on a dissertation defense at the University of Lille as the foreign member of the committee. The candidate had completed a dissertation on Marguerite Gérard, which included a catalogue raisonné of her works. While this candidate produced a work that fit the expectations of a catalogue raisonné, she simultaneously revitalized the tradition by focusing on issues that might not otherwise have been included. Notably, she analyzed the entire enterprise, and I use the term pointedly to suggest an economic institution, the entire enterprise of the Fragonard Atelier in which Marguerite Gérard was a key player. The catalogue raisonné became an analysis of the economics of art production and networks of artistic collaboration, as well as a desperately needed recuperation of Marguerite Gérard's work that brought to light paintings that were in private collections and had been lost since the early 19th century. And here's another obvious point. Before we can write histories of women artists, whether they be national histories or histories of a particular century, whether they be histories that separate women artists from their male colleagues or histories that include them within larger histories, we need to have the primary research conducted on individual women. So what are the challenges now to writing histories of women artists? What are the larger theoretical and historical trends that might aid us in writing these histories? I'd like to begin or complete that discussion by going back to the issues raised at the beginning of my talk, the shearing off of biography from history and of particular from general history. Although as a form of popular history, biography has never stopped pleasing the unlettered, professional historians of all sorts have begun returning to considerations of individual lives, whether of notable figures or ordinary individuals. That return actually has its roots in 1958, when Amsterdam historian Jacques Presser coined the term ego document to describe memoirs, autobiographies, diaries, private journals, personal letters, and other forms of autobiographical writing and oral reminiscences, often by ordinary people. Presser himself wrote a history of Dutch Jews during the German occupation, in which he drew on personal accounts, diaries, letters, and interviews with both victims and perpetrators. In 1958, however, most historians found subjective accounts as doubtful sources, and nearly half a century went by before the concept of ego documents traveled outside the Netherlands. The reassessment of ego documents coincided with the emergence of new forms of history in the 70s and 80s, in specific the history of mentalité and microhistory. Ego documents are now themselves considered as both sources and objects of study. In fact, in 2008, the European Science Foundation sponsored a massive conference in Bordeaux called Ego Documents in a European Context. Interest in ego documents has spilled over into contemporary art. Witness the exposition, Ego Documents, the Autobiographical in Contemporary Art, held in Bern in 2008. The exposition was touted as showing the work of artists who make their life the theme of their art. Central to an autobiographical work is the artist's conscious manipulation of memories with the intent to transform her life or his life experience into an artistic experience for the viewer. If we grant to the self-portrait the term ego document, are there other works of art that might also fit that category? For example, portraits of family members, of close associates, images that refer to art making or to emotional experiences. Although Jacques Presser is considered as the generator of a new interest in ego documents as a source of history, since the 17th century, women were writing ego documents as history. And in the 19th century, women like Elizabeth Ellet drew on ego documents to write the history of women artists. Thus, we might claim this interest in such materials as part of a tradition of history writing initiated by women and tied to their particular position in the social order. In this light, Vigée Lebrun's Souvenirs can be read differently, not simply as a source for her life, but as a particular history of women's art, produced at a particular time and place, as well as a commentary on the history of taste. In her Souvenirs, the artist frequently raises issues that circulated around her position as a woman in the art world, offered a picture of artistic practices within the larger society, and commented extensively on the works of art she saw in her travels abroad. The Souvenirs inscribe another point of view into the history of art by undermining prevailing ideologies about women, women's bodies, and their capacity for making great art. These include preserving modesty while gazing at male sitters, establishing a relation to a discourse that excluded women from the category great artist, defending one's work against the claim that it was copied or even painted by a male colleague, as well as countering the slander that followed women prominent in the public eye. There are, I believe, ego documents already known or potentially recoverable for women artists, especially if we consider the many self-representations women have left. Read together, these documents Read together, these documents can help to shape the histories of women artists we choose to write by suggesting new ways of organizing material. Currently, we tend to organize not only nationally, but also temporally, by genre and by institution. And often surveys of art history remain organized artist by artist. But are there other ways to write our histories? Historians are asking the same question about writing women's history, noting that the historiographic tradition, its periodizations, categories, and narrative plots resist the introduction of women into our field of vision. They are asking, does one accept traditional periodization? Does one use already recognized phenomena of historical importance? Are there different turning points in women's history? How can women's history move beyond the traditional political and economic narrative to offer a deeper treatment of social processes? Can a history of women be attuned to the critical turning points in the lives of men and women and grasp the ways social contexts set the stage for men's and women's redefining of their identities? So what new categories, informed by ego documents and work of art, can we imagine for writing a history of women artists? I want to suggest some of the strategies my co-author Melissa Hyde and I are just beginning to develop in writing a history of French women artists between 1730 and 1830. From the start, we were determined not to focus only on the exceptional women, but to recover the more general history of women artists, and especially of those who have not yet been integrated, despite their visibility in the art world of their time. We have chosen to write our history of French women artists as a history of art that includes both men and women from a different point of view, one that combines both particular and general histories and uses ego documents along with other materials. Our aim is to offer a critical history of the training and practices of women artists in dynamic interaction with the men who were their colleagues, collaborators, teachers, patrons, and collectors, and sometimes, and usually, also their fathers, brothers, and husbands. In exploring the lives and works of women artists and the many networks that connected men and women together, we hope to broaden our perspectives on the relationships between gender, art, and the politics of identity. The history we are writing more or less sidesteps extensive interpretation of individual works, save for self-representations. It does, however, take up the question of how specific women artists appropriated, changed, or even subverted the dominant trends in art making, and how and why they affiliated themselves with certain traditions and not with others. We started out imagining our project with the usual categories: genre, temporal change, institutional affiliation, and so forth. But the more we tried to work with that organization, the more other issues came to the fore. Among the organizing features we are now considering are spatial, societal, and economic. Women in the family atelier, the impact of marriage and child rearing on women's artists' careers, the entwined discourses of gender and creativity, the different strategies for constructing oneself as an artist and their relation to prevailing image making. And we are approaching the question of tradition by examining the training of artists by both men and women, studying not only the drawing academies and ateliers over which men presided, but also those that women organized. And finally, we are looking at how these women and their art were constructed in the writings of both men and women in their own time and throughout history. Thus, we hope to recast and reframe our understandings of the historical past and foster a way of seeing it as richer, more complex, and more diverse than the dominant single-sex narratives of art history have suggested. Such narratives occluded women artists who are actually very much a part of the broader, everyday art world. We view our work as a stepping stone to much larger histories of women in the visual arts. I believe that the study of women artists and the issues brought forth through that study did and can challenge and change the discipline of art history, especially if we look back to the statistics of 1974 and assess the situation today. But I equally believe that this study has not revolutionized the discipline, nor has it changed our textbooks' histories of art in any substantial way, beyond adding to them a few artists from groups traditionally marginalized in the art world. Contemporary women artists are certainly more evident in collections and exhibitions, but it was only in 2010 that either MoMA or the Centre Pompidou adequately recognized the contribution of women to modern and contemporary art. And although there are many more women represented on our museums, they are still small in number in relation to men. And many women artists who are celebrated in their own times remain all but lost to art history, whether or not they have a large extant oeuvre. Part of the reason that these women are still missing, and I believe part of the reason why we have not revolutionized the discipline, is precisely the turn away from the recuperation of women artists. I believe that now is the time that we turn to writing the histories of women artists. Now is the time, because if we let the remaining enthusiasm for this project dissipate, we may not recover it again for half a century. Now is also the time to reevaluate all the reasons why so many turned away from that project. And now is the time to ask what waves will carry us into the future study of women in the visual arts, and which of those waves might finally revolutionize the discipline. Thank you. Questions?